Discover how a daring military operation born from an impossible dilemma reshaped modern warfare and brought down a rogue dictator. Thousands of meters above the Pacific Ocean, a pair of jagged black shapes sliced through the cold night, barely visible against the midnight sky. These were F-117 Nighthawks, the U.S. military's newest and most advanced attack aircraft, embarking on their first-ever combat mission. The Nighthawks remained undetected as they sped towards the Rio Hato military airfield in central Panama. This base was home to the Panamanian Defense Forces, 6th and 7th Rifle Companies, comprising some of the most loyal and well-trained troops in the nation. It was December 20, 1989, and this was the opening act of Operation Just Cause, a mission over a year in the making. The F-117 pilots had been assigned a task as specific and precise as their aircraft's design, not to kill the PDF troops, but to deliver a profound shock. They possessed the perfect tools for the job. Each aircraft was equipped with a remarkably precise 907-kilogram BLU-109 penetration bomb. Huddled in their high-tech cockpits, the pilots peered across infrared screens as their targets came into sight. Not the barracks themselves, where the PDF troops were stationed, but a pair of open fields just outside. The plan was simple: drop the bombs in the fields, close enough to avoid major casualties, yet generating a concussive blast powerful enough to deafen the soldiers, leaving them completely disoriented. From there, U.S. troops would have little trouble rushing in and taking control, keeping bloodshed to a minimum. But as the pilots approached their target, they realized something was amiss. Unexpectedly high winds swept across the area, giving the pilots mere seconds to adjust their flight paths and compensate. The lead Nighthawk swung to the left, dropping its payload a mere 55 meters from the barracks, a location originally intended for the other aircraft. The second pilot, realizing the plan had gone awry, also turned left, dropping his bomb even further away, about 275 meters from the target originally assigned to the first pilot. The bombs exploded. A plume of fire and dirt burst into the night air, and a powerful shockwave rippled outward. But instead of stunning the 6th and 7th companies into submission, the blasts had the opposite effect. The U.S. had just delivered the PDF, the biggest wake-up call they would ever receive. Inside the barracks, startled yet alert, soldiers reached for their rifles as the first American troops prepared to charge. The invasion had officially begun, targeting a man Washington once had on its payroll, General Manuel Noriega. Noriega had spent over 2 decades as a CIA asset, serving as both an informant and intelligence broker. He monitored communist figures and left-wing movements, providing intelligence while facilitating American operations across the region. But by the late 1980s, everything had changed. The asset had gone rogue. After becoming Panama's de facto ruler in 1983, Noriega slowly but surely transformed his country into a narco-kleptocracy. He befriended drug-smuggling cartels, such as Colombia's Medellin cartel, accepting bribes and shares of their illicit profits, effectively turning the Panama Canal into a thoroughfare for cocaine and other narcotics. The man Washington once trusted had become a dictator, annulling democratic elections and unleashing his so-called dignity battalions on his own, people violently suppressing their right to protest. Then, on December 15, 1989, he officially declared a state of war between Panama and the U.S. Washington needed Noriega gone, but achieving this required solving a seemingly impossible strategic problem. Panama was not just any battlefield. It was a narrow, incredibly important strip of land that also happened to be home to a large number of American citizens. 35,000 of them, to be precise. Thousands of U.S. military personnel and their loved ones were scattered across the country's canal zone, often only meters away from the nearest PDF barracks. General Maxwell Thurman, head of Southern Command and the man in charge of planning Operation Just Cause, understood how quickly this situation could spiral into perhaps the worst hostage crisis in American history. If the U.S. were to launch a slow, conventional military buildup, Noriega would anticipate it. With a single order, he could transform every hotel, school, and canal checkpoint into a fortress, taking thousands, even tens of thousands of American men, women, and children hostage, using them as human shields to force the U.S. to back down. Thurman could not let that happen. A standard invasion was not an option. The operation had to be swift and surprising, a single powerful knockout blow in which America struck Panama so hard and so fast that the PDF would be effectively neutralized before Noriega could even issue a single command. With his objective set, Thurman began to piece his plan together. On December 16, 1989, the night after Noriega declared war, events escalated. At approximately 21, 4 American military officers were on their way to dinner at the Marriott Caesar Park Hotel in downtown Panama City. The men were unarmed and in a private vehicle. At a roadblock outside the PDF headquarters in Panama City's El Chorrillo neighborhood, the Americans' vehicle was ordered to stop. An angry crowd of civilians surrounded the vehicle, and the American officers began to fear for their lives. Tensions rose and tempers flared. The American officers attempted to flee, and the PDF soldiers opened fire. A single round entered the rear of the vehicle, striking Marine First Lieutenant Robert Paz in the back. The Marine captain driving the car was also shot in the foot as the Americans made their escape. They rushed Paz to Gorgas Army Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. In the chaos, a U.S. Navy SEAL and his wife, witnessing the attack, were dragged away and beaten by PDF troops. Panama had made the first move, and for Washington it could not go unpunished. President George H.W. Bush gave the order. The Panama invasion plan, Operation Just Cause, would proceed. This would not be like any other invasion the world had seen before. U.S. forces would not focus on front-line assaults or steady buildups. Its entire operation was designed around the concept of simultaneity, multiple attacks from multiple sides all occurring at the exact same time. ZO-1 on December 20. HOR. 27 key targets were identified, including airfields, PDF bases, communication hubs, and strongholds. The U.S. knew it possessed far stronger military capabilities than Panama, but this mission was not just a matter of strength, but of speed. Forces would need to strike numerous nerve centers across the country without delay, denying the PDF any ability to respond. The U.S. mobilized a massive joint force, including personnel from the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, and the Coast Guard. Elite Delta Force and Navy SEAL units would lead the way, backed by ground forces like the 75th Ranger Regiment and the 5th Infantry Division. It was a massive, synchronized strike. If a single drop zone was missed or a raid delayed, the PDF would have time to coordinate, and the civilian casualty count would skyrocket. This mission, perhaps the most complex airborne operation since World War II, could not afford to go wrong. December 20th, 1989, or 15 minutes before hour, the main operation was about to begin. But before Just Cause could kick off, another smaller yet incredibly important mission had to take place: Operation Acid Gambit. It was perhaps the most delicate part of the entire invasion plan, with an American man's life hanging in the balance. His name was Kurt Muse, a CIA asset who led an underground movement named the Voice of Liberty, aimed at overthrowing Noriega. Using propaganda and covert radio transmissions, Muse hoped to sow the seeds of an uprising against the Panamanian dictator. But his efforts were thwarted in 1989 when he was found and arrested by the authorities, subsequently spending 9 months in the infamous Cárcel Modelo prison. There, in a tiny cell, Muse waited. According to intelligence reports, Noriega himself had issued a dead man's switch execution order on the American. As soon as any sign of a U.S. invasion or attack was detected, Muse was to be executed, an instant and brutal retaliation for even the slightest hint of military action against Panama. But the U.S. had no intention of letting that happen. So in the minutes leading up to HOR, 4 MH-6 Little Bird helicopters took to the skies, hovering over the rooftops of Panama City. Inside were Delta Force operators, some of the best-trained military personnel on the planet. They weren't dropped off on the street, but directly onto the prison roof, breaching the rooftop door with explosives before descending the flights of stairs towards Muse's cell. There, a guard had been assigned the task of executing Muse in case of any attempted rescue. He was neutralized by a Delta operator before he even had time to reach for his weapon. The team moved in, firing at the lock on the cell door, which failed to break. They then deployed a small explosive to breach the door, handing Muse a set of body armor, a ballistic helmet, and goggles before escorting him to the roof and loading him onto one of the little birds. All that remained was to evacuate and fly back to base. But then, disaster struck. PDF soldiers in the area were now fully aware of what was happening, and they had no intention of letting the U.S. forces disappear into the night with their prisoner. Firing everything from heavy machine guns to rocket-propelled grenades, the PDF forces unleashed hell upon the Americans. The helicopter transporting Muse was hit. It wobbled, lost lift, and suddenly began a terrifying descent onto the street below, slamming into the ground and crashing into a nearby building. Numerous Delta operators on board were wounded but alive. Dragging Muse from the wreckage, they scrambled through dimly lit alleys and took cover wherever they could find it, setting up a last-stand perimeter and signaling to a nearby gunship with an infrared strobe light. PDF troops were closing in on their position. Ammunition was running low. It looked like it was only a matter of minutes until this small group of Americans was eliminated. The perimeter was on the verge of collapsing when an M113 armored personnel carrier from the 5th Infantry Division smashed through the Panamanian barricades, clearing the alley with 50 caliber suppression fire to save Muse and the Delta team. The dead man's switch had failed, and Noriega was about to feel the full force of the United States military. The full invasion of Panama was now underway. All across the country, elite teams of American military personnel were taking over their targets, working to achieve an array of objectives, including disabling the PDF and crippling the country's communications networks. But there was one objective arguably even more important than the rest, one target that mattered most of all: Noriega himself. He could not be allowed to escape, and a 48-man Navy SEAL team was moving toward the coast to ensure that. Their target, Punta Paitilla Airfield, a coastal airport in Panama City, where Noriega's private jet, a 1980 Learjet 35, was situated. The U.S. knew that despite his tough guy persona, Noriega wouldn't want to stick around too long once the first shots were fired. But if the SEALs disabled the jet, then that couldn't happen. It sounded like a simple mission, but it had been made much more complicated by the constraints of the larger operation. U.S. commanders didn't want to simply bomb or destroy the airfield. They wanted to keep it intact for future use. That meant the Navy couldn't just send out an AC-130 Spectre gunship or carry out heavy demolition of the area. The SEALs were, instead, ordered to use only minimum force to disable the aircraft. They needed to move in, inflict enough damage to the jet to prevent a takeoff, by shooting out its tires or cutting its control wires, and then move out as quickly and silently as possible. Approaching the airfield from the water, the SEALs slipped stealthily onto the edge of the runway. It was a well-lit airport, with heavily armed PDF guards all around, ready to open fire in an instant, caught in the open. The SEALs were perfectly silhouetted by the bright runway lights. The Panamanian defenders fired from the cover of pitch-black hangars, trapping the Americans in a deadly kill zone. Numerous SEALs were shot. The minimum force requirement was no longer relevant. Now anything went, and one of the SEALs fired an AT-4 anti-tank rocket at Noriega's jet, ensuring it had zero chance of leaving the ground. With their objective achieved, the SEALs held the area long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The jet was destroyed, but the price paid was high. 4 SEALs lost their lives, with 8 more suffering serious injuries. While smaller elite units were busy with their own operations, the main force literally descended on Panama. At locations like Rio Hato and the Torrijos Tocuman International Airport, thousands of paratroopers from units such as the 75th Ranger Regiment and the 82nd Airborne Division carried out one of the largest combat jumps since the 1940s, drifting behind enemy lines and right into the hot zone of the invasion. If they stayed in the air too long, the paratroopers would be sitting ducks, easily picked off by PDF forces on the ground. To prevent this, the C-130s transporting the U.S. troops flew at incredibly low altitudes, a mere 150 meters from the ground. At such a height, once paratroopers left the planes, they were in the air for barely 12 seconds before hitting the ground. The scene was chaotic. Transport's planes skirted above Panamanian rooftops as dozens of paratroopers spilled out into the air, battling the heavy winds that raged across the Central American landscape. Not all of them had easy landings. Some slammed into runways, trees, or even surrounding marshland at high speeds. Others lost their gear bags or radios while descending, and some even fell right on top of PDF positions, having to hurriedly defend themselves in a desperate bid to stay alive as enemy rounds raced their way. Despite broken bones, lost gear, and scattered squads, the paratroopers managed to remain calm, putting their skills and experience to good use, and turning the chaotic conditions to their advantage. While the PDF troops relied on spotlights and muzzle flashes to illuminate the darkness and catch brief, intermittent glimpses of their enemies, the Americans had the benefit of the latest technology. Paratroopers were equipped with night vision goggles that illuminated the darkness of the early hours. Small groups of Rangers found one another in the dark, with some even forming new ad hoc squads before moving on together, clearing out enemy locations and achieving their objectives. The PDF, a largely paramilitary police force, lacked the training or preparedness to cope with a combat scenario like this, and was soon overwhelmed. At Rio Hato, Ranger battalions took control of the airfield in less than an hour, despite the F-117 Nighthawks being unable to successfully stun the defenders in the area. By the time the sun began to rise, Noriega's finest troops had either been eliminated, captured, or fled. The mass hostage nightmare that General Thurman had feared never came to pass. The speed of the American assault was so overwhelming that most enemy forces had no time to react or even receive their orders. Some were killed or wounded, but many simply laid down their weapons and surrendered. The simultaneity strategy was a success, and the PDF was no more, but the primary objective had yet to be completed. Noriega still hadn't been caught. Even without his plane, in the chaos and carnage of those early exchanges, he managed to slip away, surviving the initial bombings and vanishing into the streets of Panama City. In the days that followed, the U.S. organized a nationwide manhunt. A $1 million bounty was placed on Noriega's head, but days passed without any sign of his location. But then, just before Christmas of 1989, Noriega resurfaced. He sought asylum in the Apostolic Nunciature, the Vatican Embassy in Panama City. In doing so, he established a diplomatic stalemate. The U.S. could not storm its embassy and trigger international outrage, but it also couldn't let Noriega simply sit there and plot his next move. Faced with this dilemma, the U.S. Army devised a truly unique solution, something nobody would have predicted. The Psychological Operations PSYOPS team decided to surround the entire embassy with a gigantic wall of speakers and carry out an acoustic bombardment of Noriega's hideout. They blasted rock and heavy metal, including Van Halen's Panama and Judas Priest's You've Got Another Thing, common for 24 hours a day. This was weaponized sensory overload, designed to cause total psychological exhaustion and sleep deprivation. Slowly but surely, the wall of sound tactic began to work. Anyone could survive listening to loud music for a few hours. But when it was played non-stop, day after day, night after night, at ear-piercing volumes, preventing sleep or even coherent thought, it became one of the most effective non-violent forms of torture imaginable. He held out for more than a week, but in the end, Noriega had had enough. On January 3, 1990, he walked out of the embassy, tired and broken, and surrendered to the authorities. He was promptly extradited to Miami, where he faced charges of drug trafficking and racketeering. Operation Just Cause was complete. Within just a few weeks, the U.S. military had deposed a dictator and shattered a paramilitary force. It had also proven the potency of a whole new doctrine, one that relied not on the slow and gradual tactics of times gone by, but was instead driven by speed and stealth.